Neil was not the kind of man who looked for trouble. He was not the kind of man who looked for much of anything, really. He lived alone at the edge of a small farming village, in a stone house with a low roof and a garden that grew more weeds than vegetables. He fixed things for people, fences, wheels, old tools, and they paid him in coin or food, and that was enough for him. He did not ask questions. He did not make friends easily. He kept to himself, and the village mostly let him. That evening, the rain came hard. Neil had been in the forest since midday, cutting wood for a farmer named Greg who lived on the far side of the hill. The work had taken longer than expected, and by the time he packed his tools and started the walk home, the sky had already turned dark and the rain was falling in heavy sheets. The path back to the village ran along the edge of a wide ditch that filled with water every time the storms came. Neil had walked it 100 times. He knew every stone and root along the way. He was almost past the ditch when he heard it. It was not a loud sound. It was small. Wet. A thin and broken noise that barely rose above the sound of the rain. Neil stopped walking. He stood still and listened. The sound came again, a weak, struggling breath, coming from somewhere below the path. He took one step toward the edge of the ditch and looked down. At first he saw only mud and dark water. Then he saw the shape. It was small. Much smaller than he expected. A dragon hatchling, half buried in the mud at the bottom of the ditch, one tiny wing twisted at a wrong angle beneath its body. Its scales, which should have been bright, were pale and gray. Its eyes were closed. Its chest moved, but only just. Each breath it took was shallow and slow, like a candle flame in the wind that could go out at any moment. Neil stared at it for a long time. He looked around. There was no mother. No nest nearby. No sign that any other dragon had been in this part of the forest recently. The hatchling was completely alone. It had either fallen from somewhere above or been swept here by the water. Either way, it had been lying in that cold mud for a while. That much was clear from how still it was. Neil was not a man who made fast decisions. He thought things through. He weighed them carefully. He had learned a long time ago that stepping into something without thinking usually made things worse. But the hatchling took another one of those thin, struggling breaths, and Neil stopped thinking. He climbed down into the ditch. The mud pulled at his boots and the cold water soaked through his trousers immediately, but he did not stop. He moved carefully, making sure not to press down on the hatchling's broken wing as he reached under it with both hands. The creature was heavier than it looked, dense and solid even at this small size, but Neil lifted it slowly and held it against his chest. The hatchling did not move. It did not open its eyes. It just kept breathing those thin, quiet breaths. Neil pulled off his coat with one hand, keeping the hatchling pressed against his shirt with the other. He wrapped the coat around the small body as tightly as he could without hurting it, tucking the fabric under and around the crushed wing to hold it still. The hatchling was ice cold against his hands. He could feel how fragile it was. How close to the edge it was sitting. He climbed back up out of the ditch and stood on the path. The rain was still falling hard. The walk home was a long one. His wood was still back at the forest and Greg would want it in the morning. His boots were full of cold mud. His shirt was soaked through and the night was getting colder by the minute. Neil looked down at the small wrapped shape in his arms. Then he turned and started walking home. He walked fast. Not running, running would shake the hatchling too much, but fast, with long steady steps, keeping the creature pressed close to his chest where his body heat could reach it through the coat. He kept one hand under the hatchling's body and one hand over the top, shielding it from the rain. He did not stop. He did not slow down. He just walked, eyes on the path ahead, jaw set against the cold. By the time he reached his house, he could no longer feel his fingers. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. The house was dark and cold, the fire had gone out hours ago. Neil set the hatchling down on the old wooden table as gently as he could and immediately went to work on the fire. His hands were stiff and slow, but the fire caught after the third try, and within a few minutes the room was beginning to warm. He brought the hatchling close to the fire and unwrapped the coat slowly. In the firelight, the creature looked even worse than it had in the ditch. The wing was badly damaged. There were cuts along its side that had been washed clean by the rain but were still deep. Its scales were dry now but still pale, not the pale of a healthy hatchling, but the pale of something that had given most of itself away just trying to stay alive. Neil sat down on the floor in front of the fire and looked at it for a moment. Then he got up, went to his shelf, and began gathering what he had. He was going to need all of it. Neil had very little that most people would call proper medical supplies. He had a small tin of salve that he used for cuts and scrapes from his work. He had clean cloth that he kept for wrapping tool handles. He had a thin piece of flat wood that he used as a straight edge for measuring fence posts. He had water, a fire, and steady hands. It was not much. But it was what he had, and so it was what he used. He started with the wounds on the hatchling side. They were not as deep as he had feared when he first saw them in the dark. The rain had already cleaned most of the dirt out, which was the one good thing about the whole night. Neil tore the clean cloth into strips and pressed them gently against each cut, holding them still until the bleeding slowed. The hatchling did not move during any of this. It lay completely still, its small chest rising and falling in that slow and shallow rhythm that Neil had already come to watch too closely. He applied the salve carefully. It was made for human skin, not dragon scales, but it was all he had, and doing something was better than doing nothing. He pressed it into the cuts with the tip of his finger and covered each one with a strip of cloth. Not perfect, but clean and tight and better than leaving them open. Then he looked at the wing. The wing was the part that worried him most. It was bent at a place where it should have been straight, and the thin membrane between the bones was torn in two places. Neil had fixed broken things his whole life. He knew that a bone set wrong would heal wrong. He knew that if he did nothing, the wing would heal in that twisted shape and never work properly again. He also knew that what he was about to do was going to hurt. He worked slowly. He placed one hand flat under the wing to support it and used his other hand to feel along the bone until he found where the break was. The hatchling made a sound then, the first sound it had made since he found it. A low, thin cry that was barely louder than a breath. Neil stopped. He waited. The hatchling's chest kept rising and falling. Its eyes stayed closed. Neil continued. He moved the bone back as gently as he could to the position it was supposed to be in. Then he took the flat piece of wood and laid it along the underside of the wing to hold everything straight. He wrapped cloth around and around, firm but not tight, until the wing was held still against the splint. He tied it off with a careful knot and sat back and looked at his work. It was not the work of someone who knew dragons. But it was the work of someone who paid attention, and sometimes that was close enough. He fed more wood into the fire and sat down on the floor beside the table. The hatchling was close to the heat now, close enough that the pale color of its scales was already beginning to look slightly less alarming. Neil leaned his back against the leg of the table and stretched his legs out in front of him. His clothes were still damp. His boots were still cold. He was tired in the deep way that comes not just from a long day of work but from the kind of focus that uses up something inside a person. He told himself he would rest for just a few minutes. He did not sleep. Every time his eyes began to close, the hatchling would shift slightly or its breathing would change just enough that Neil's eyes would open again and he would sit up and check. He did this through the whole night. The fire burned down and he built it back up. The rain outside slowly stopped. The village went completely quiet. The hours passed the way they do when a person is waiting for something, slowly and all at once. Somewhere in the deep part of the night, the hatchling's breathing changed. It became steadier. Slower in a different way, not the slow of something fading, but the slow of something finally resting. Neil noticed it immediately. He leaned forward and watched for a long moment. The pale color in the scales had shifted again. There was something warmer underneath now. Something that had not been there before. He sat back and let out a long breath. He stayed awake anyway. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to come through the small window above the door, Neil was still sitting on the floor with his back against the table leg and his arms resting on his knees. The fire was low but still going. The house was warm. Outside, a bird made one quiet sound in the early morning silence. And the hatchling opened its eyes. They were gold. A deep and steady gold, like the color of firelight held inside something solid. The hatchling did not move its body. It did not make a sound. It simply opened those gold eyes and looked directly at Neil. Neil looked back. There was something in that look that Neil could not quite name. It was not the look of a frightened animal waking in a strange place. It was not confused or wild or desperate. It was calm. Aware. It looked at Neil the way a person looks at someone they have been waiting a long time to meet. Neil reached behind him to the shelf without breaking eye contact and picked up the small spoon and the cup of water he had set there hours ago. He dipped the spoon and held it carefully to the hatchling's mouth. The hatchling drank. Then it drank again. And again. Every spoonful Neil offered, it took. Slowly and quietly, without rushing, without looking away from his face. Neil kept his hand steady and kept offering the water until the cup was empty. He set the cup down. The hatchling's gold eyes stayed on him, calm and unblinking. Neil said nothing. There was nothing to say yet. He simply reached out and rested two fingers very lightly on top of the hatchling's head, the way a person might rest a hand on the shoulder of someone who had just come through something hard. The hatchling closed its eyes again and slept. The hatchling stayed sick for 4 more days. Neil did not leave the house much during that time. He sent word to Greg that the wood would be late and left a short note with the boy who ran messages through the village. Greg was not happy about it, but Neil had never missed a job before, and the note said he would make it right, so Greg waited. Neil changed the cloth on the wounds twice a day. He checked the splint each morning to make sure it had not shifted in the night. He kept the fire going and kept the water fresh and fed the hatchling small amounts of whatever he thought it could manage, soft bread soaked in warm water, a little broth made from dried meat, thin porridge that he mashed until it was almost liquid. The hatchling ate slowly at first. Then a little faster. Then, by the 3rd day, it was watching the bowl before Neil even had it ready. That was when Neil knew it was going to be fine. On the 5th day the hatchling stood up on its own for the first time. It was shaky and slow and it immediately sat back down again, but it had stood. Neil was at his workbench when it happened and he turned around just in time to see it. He did not say anything. He just nodded once and turned back to his work. The hatchling watched him for the rest of the morning. It was sometime during that week, while Neil was sitting by the fire in the evening and the hatchling was lying near his feet, that the name came to him. He had not been trying to think of one. It just arrived the way quiet things sometimes do, without being called. The hatchling's scales, now that it was healthy and warm, had settled into a color that was not quite silver and not quite gray. In the firelight they looked like the color of ash from a fire that had burned a long time and was still holding its warmth. Neil looked down at it and said, simply, "Ash." The hatchling lifted its head and looked at him. Neil nodded. "That is your name." Ash looked at him for one more moment, then put his head back down. But his tail moved once, a slow sweep across the stone floor, and Neil took that as agreement. 3 weeks after the night in the mud, Ash was walking around the house on his own. The splint came off after 2 weeks and the wing hung at a slight angle that would probably never fully correct itself, but the bone had healed and the tears in the membrane had closed cleanly. Neil watched him move around the small space and felt something settle in his chest that he did not examine too closely. He had expected Ash to want out. He had expected that once the hatchling was strong enough to move and eat and function on his own, some instinct would pull him toward the door and the forest and whatever life a young dragon was supposed to live. Neil had already thought about how he would handle it. He would open the door. He would step aside. He would not make it into something it did not need to be. He opened the door one morning to let in the cool air. Ash walked to the doorway, stood there for a moment, looked out at the path and the trees beyond, and then turned around and went back to his spot near the fire. Neil stared at the open doorway for a moment. Then he went back to work. This became the pattern of things. Neil went about his days and Ash went with him. Not always close. Not always underfoot. But always near. When Neil worked in the yard, Ash sat at the edge of the garden and watched. When Neil walked to the village to pick up supplies, Ash followed at a distance, stopping when Neil stopped, moving when Neil moved. People stared. Neil did not stare back. He bought his flour and his salt and walked home, and Ash padded along behind him like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. At night Ash slept near the front door. Not inside, not outside, but right at the threshold with his body pressed against the base of the door. Neil nearly tripped over him twice in the dark before he learned to step carefully. He did not ask Ash to move. It did not seem like the right thing to do. The trouble with the village came on a Tuesday. Neil was in his yard splitting wood when he heard the gate open. He turned to find the village elder, a wide and serious man named Frank, walking toward him with the particular expression of a person who has decided something and wants to get it over with. Frank stopped a few feet away and looked at Ash, who was sitting near the woodpile watching Neil work. Then Frank looked at Neil. He said that the village had concerns. He said that a dragon, even a small one, living at the edge of the settlement was not something people were comfortable with. He said there had been talk. He said that some families with children were worried, and that a few of the farmers near the tree line had started finding their mornings unpleasant, always wondering if the dragon was nearby. He said it in a reasonable tone. He was not unkind about it. He was simply delivering a message that a group of people had asked him to deliver. Neil listened to all of it without interrupting. When Frank finished, Neil was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he appreciated Frank coming to tell him personally. He said it genuinely, without sharpness or irritation. Frank nodded, looking slightly relieved that it had gone calmly. Neil thanked him for the visit. Then he turned, walked to his front door, and closed it behind him. Frank stood in the yard alone for a moment. Then he let himself out through the gate. Ash watched him go, then turned back toward the house and settled down against the base of the door, tail curled around his feet, eyes half closed in the afternoon sun. A year passed. Ash grew. Not in the slow and uncertain way he had grown during those first 6 weeks in Neil's house. He grew the way things grow when they have been given what they need and left alone to become what they are supposed to be. Steady and sure and a little surprising each time Neil looked at him properly after a few days of not really looking. By the end of that first year Ash was up to Neil's shoulder when he stood beside him. His scales had deepened from that soft ash gray into something darker and harder, like stone that had been sitting in the sun for a long time. His neck was thick. His legs were solid. His claws, which had once been small enough that Neil could hold the whole foot in one hand, were now long and curved and left clean marks in the dirt when he walked. The wing never fully straightened. Neil had known it would not. The bone had healed well but the angle it settled into was permanent now, a slight downward curve on the left side that gave Ash an uneven look when he stood still. Some of the village children had laughed about it once, calling him the broken dragon, and Neil had heard it from across the road and said nothing. Ash had heard it too. He had looked at the children for a moment with those calm gold eyes and then looked away, unbothered, the way a mountain is unbothered by the wind. But the wing, crooked as it was, worked. It just worked differently. Neil noticed it first one morning when a bird flew low across the yard and Ash launched off the ground after it. He did not go up the way a healthy dragon would, climbing high and fast into the sky. He went out, low and flat and extraordinarily fast, skimming just above the ground with his body angled and his crooked wing cutting the air in a way that a straight wing simply could not. He moved like something thrown rather than something flying. Direct. Immediate. Gone before Neil had fully registered that he had moved at all. The bird escaped. But only just. Neil stood in his yard for a moment after that and thought about what he had seen. Then he went back inside and said nothing about it, the way he said nothing about most things that mattered. Ash practiced on his own after that. Neil would hear him in the early mornings, the sound of something moving fast through the air just above the ground near the tree line. He never watched. He just listened and went about his work. But he noticed that Ash came back from those mornings with a sharper look about him. More settled. More sure of himself. The village, for its part, had reached an uneasy peace with Ash's presence. Frank had come to the gate 2 more times in that first year, and both times Neil had listened politely and thanked him and closed the door. After the second time Frank did not come back. The complaints did not stop entirely, but they became quieter. People learned to walk past Neil's house without staring too long. They learned that Ash, for all his size, did not bother anyone who did not come onto the property. And slowly, without anyone deciding it out loud, Ash became part of the edge of the village the way a large old tree becomes part of a road. People navigated around him. They noted where he was. But they stopped expecting him to be gone. The night the men came was in late autumn. Neil had heard rumors that week. A village 2 days east had been visited by a group of armed men who had taken grain stores and tools and left warnings about coming back for more. It was the kind of news that spread fast through small farming communities. People locked their doors earlier. The men who had dogs kept them close. Neil heard the rumors, nodded, and said nothing. That night he went to bed at his usual time. The fire was low. The house was quiet. Outside, as always, Ash was at the door. Neil was not sure what woke him. It was not a loud sound. It was the absence of sound, that particular quality of silence that falls over a place when something in it is paying very close attention. He lay still for a moment and listened. Then he got up, pulled on his boots, and went to the window. The road that ran past the front of his property was dark. But at the far end of it, where the path curved toward the center of the village, there were shapes. 4 of them. Moving slowly and quietly with the particular careful movement of people who do not want to be heard. Neil looked toward his door. Ash was not there. He was already at the road. Neil could see him in the dark, that low dark shape sitting perfectly still in the middle of the path, directly between the 4 men and the village. Not making a sound. Not moving. Just waiting, the way a stone wall waits, without urgency and without any intention of going anywhere. The men stopped. Neil could not hear what they said from the window. But he saw them look at each other. He saw one of them take a step forward. And then Ash moved, not charging, not lunging, just rising to his full height and spreading his wings, that crooked left one flaring wide and strange in the dark, and a sound came from him that Neil felt in his chest from inside the house. It was not a roar. It was lower than that. Older than that. The men ran. Not one at a time. All 4 of them, immediately, back the way they had come, and the sound of their boots on the road disappeared into the dark very quickly and then was gone entirely. Neil stood at the window for a moment. Then he went back to bed. In the morning Ash was at the door again, in his usual spot, tail curled around his feet, eyes half closed, as if nothing had happened. Neil stepped over him on the way to the yard, paused, and rested his hand briefly on the top of Ash's head. Ash's tail moved once across the stone step. Neil went to make his fire. 10 years passed. Then 5 more. Neil's hair went gray slowly, the way it does with men who work outside and do not think much about such things. The lines on his face deepened. His hands, always rough from work, became the hands of an older man, still steady, still capable, but slower in the mornings when the cold settled into the joints. He moved a little more carefully now. He rested a little more often. He did not complain about any of it because complaining about the passage of time seemed to him like complaining about rain. It came regardless. The only question was what you did while it was happening. What Neil did was work. Slower than before, but still work. And Ash stayed. Ash was fully grown now in a way that was difficult to put into words to someone who had not seen it happen gradually. He was large. Genuinely, quietly, seriously large. When he lay across the front of the property his body stretched from the gate to the door. When he stood, his head was well above the roofline. His scales had gone almost black over the years, dark and dense and smooth, with that faint gray undertone that Neil had named him for still visible in certain light, like ash beneath coal. The crooked wing had become something people talked about when they described him. Not because it was a weakness anymore. Because it was how you knew it was Ash. Every dragon that passed through the region stood straight and flew high and looked the way dragons were supposed to look. Ash looked like himself. And everyone who had heard of him knew exactly what they were looking at the moment they saw that left wing sitting at its slight downward angle. His reputation had grown the way his body had. Gradually and then all at once. After the night the 4 men ran, there had been other nights. Not many. Word traveled fast among the kind of people who made a living frightening others, and the word about Neil's road had spread to the point where most of them simply avoided the village entirely. There had been 2 more incidents over the years, once a group of men who had not heard, and once a man alone who had heard but did not believe it. Neither incident lasted long. Neither ended in serious harm to anyone. Ash had a way of making his point without needing to press it further than necessary. The village had changed its feelings about Ash completely by the 5th year, and by the 10th year the change was so total that the younger children did not even remember a time when he had not been there. They grew up with Ash as part of the landscape of their lives, the way they grew up with the old well in the square and the big oak at the edge of the market road. He was simply there. Solid and permanent and known. Frank had retired from being village elder 4 years ago. On his last day he had walked to Neil's gate, and Neil had come out to meet him, and Frank had stood there for a moment looking at Ash, who was lying in the yard in the afternoon sun. Frank had said, quietly, that he had been wrong. Neil had said that Frank had been doing what people asked him to do, and that was not the same thing as being wrong. Frank had nodded. Then he had reached over the gate and rested his hand briefly on Ash's neck the way you might greet a neighbor you had not spoken to in too long. Ash had let him. Now Neil was old enough that the villagers checked on him. Not in a way that drew attention to itself. A basket of food left at the gate. A young man stopping by to ask if the woodpile needed filling. Small quiet kindnesses offered sideways, the way people offer things to someone who has never been good at accepting them directly. Neil received all of it with the same plain thank you and went on with his days. He still worked. Less than before, but he still worked. He still fixed things when people asked. His hands still knew what they were doing even when they were slower getting started. Each evening, without fail, Ash came back. He ranged during the days now. Neil did not know exactly where he went and did not ask. He went somewhere into the hills or the forest or the open land beyond the tree line and he did whatever it was that a fully grown dragon did with a day. He was always back before the light left the sky. Neil had taken to sitting outside in the evenings on an old wooden bench he had made years ago and repaired so many times it was more repair than original bench. He sat there with a cup of something warm and watched the sky go from blue to orange to the deep quiet color it turned just before dark. And every evening Ash came down. He landed the way big things land when they have learned to be careful, not crashing, not shaking the ground the way you might expect, but settling. His crooked wing folded in first, then the right, and he lowered himself down beside the bench with a long slow breath, his body curling slightly so that his head came to rest near Neil's side. Neil would reach out and rest his hand on Ash's neck. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. Everything that mattered between them had already been said in other ways, over many years, in muddy ditches and long nights by the fire and mornings after trouble had come and gone without taking anything important with it. The village went quiet around them. The stars came out one by one. The old man and the dragon sat together in the evening the way they always had, and the night came in gently, and it was enough. It had always been enough.